Thank you. So I'm going to need both.
Can everyone hear Chris without the mic?
Can everyone hear me without the mic? Awesome. Because when I hold those, I tend to sing. It all ends horribly.
There's one on the podium as well, so that's a lot louder.
So today's talk is student engagement, or how I learned to stop worrying and love innovation. There is a reason why this pun is there, and I'll leave that all to your imaginations as to figure that out. However, the core reason is I really need to stop watching films while writing presentations. For anyone who hasn't met me, I haven't been around for very long. I've taught in classes for roughly 22 years at this point. I trained as a product designer, a computer scientist, and then finally became a games developer. I've had somewhat of an eclectic, or some may say eccentric career. I've been everything from a bodyguard, to a dog handler, to a speedboat driver, to an educator, company owner, and now I'm here. I founded companies. I worked as an innovation consultant for several years. And during the pandemic, I ran Pedagogy and Pancakes, which concluded in the Practical Pedagogy Conference. Pedagogy and Pancakes was a community-driven learning and teaching enhancement session. So once a week, we'd get together, around 800 of us, and we'd all share talks on things that we were doing and how we were responding to the shift to digital education. And I'm a National Teaching Fellow. And some of the things I'm going to be talking about today is ultimately how I ended up on the road to NTF. So what are we talking about today? So firstly, what is innovation? When should we innovate? I want to really talk about why innovation is central to my teaching philosophy. I want to talk about what student engagement is and how student engagement can facilitate innovation. I then want to provide a little bit of practical advice, talk about the i3 innovation framework, something I worked on several years ago, provide some examples of student engaged innovation, and then closing thoughts and hopefully a bit of Q&A. So what is innovation anyway? So innovation is the practical implementation of ideas resulting in new or improved outputs, processes, or activities. It's the application of ideas, not the application of necessarily new ideas. Innovation isn't always about trying to come up with a new thing. Sometimes it's taking an old thing and putting it in a new context. That is really, really important. Taking a car to somebody who only has horses would be innovative for them. It's all about consequence, outcome, rather than intent. Innovation is what is the change that has happened? What is the impact of that change? Novelty alone isn't valuable. My example here is serving pickle and poo sandwiches would certainly be novel. It wouldn't necessarily be innovative unless we generated a market for that product. New perspectives are valuable. Innovation usually happens in places where we have different perspectives coming together. Generally people and problems, people with problems and different solutions coming into the same space to discuss their issues. It's one of the reasons why networking, collaboration, reaching across the aisle is so important. Innovation is often emergent. We often don't practically intend to innovate. Innovation happens as a set of consequences. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the things that we find in higher education, coming from a policy level, from a national level, is innovation is always put as this thing we should aim to do. And often, it's not enough to go to a room of people and tell them, you now need to innovate. And often the person with the solution is not the person with the problem. That is really key to innovation. Often, innovation comes from, like say, bringing different minds together, different perspectives. So why should we innovate? Why should innovation be core to what we try and do? We're in an ever-changing sector with targets that we don't control. Every day there may be a new announcement from the government, from the OFS, that says this is now the thing that we are focused on. We don't necessarily control those KPIs, we don't necessarily control those targets, and we often need to adapt and change relatively quickly to respond to them. Routes into university aren't static. You know, students aren't, and just to kind of go back to Nick's point, students aren't homogeneous. They are not the same. Students coming from a variety of different routes, and actually the pedagogy that worked last year may not work this year. We often need to adapt to new industry requirements or subject environments. So things that we need to change The opportunity to be unique in a sector that has never been so crowded. There's never been more institutions able to award degrees. So when actually trying to stand out from that and trying to offer something unique to the sector has never been more challenging. To do things better, to avoid resting on laurels, again, we can get comfortable with a repetition, doing the same thing over and over again. And actually that doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing it the best way. Innovation is an opportunity to explore those new possibilities. To keep things interesting, I argue that HE is one of the most interesting environments to work in because we have this opportunity to experiment. I think you don't end up as a lecturer, an academic, or anybody working in HE without this interest in exploring the curious. Innovation is an opportunity to do that, especially around education. And again, I put it in twice because it's so important. Cohorts are not homogeneous. University changes its culture every single year because we lose about a third of its members. Every time we graduate a whole bunch of students, we get in a new environment. There is so much change happening in A-level, FE, BTECs, and the general entry routes into university that we cannot be guaranteed that what we've worked before will work again. So I want to talk about why innovation is important to me. I started out as a relatively conservative educator, relatively scared of changing, relatively scared of doing new things. And I think this was drummed into me. As I went through my educational training, so actually, I talked about my eccentric career. My original degree was trained to be a product design teacher. And I had it relatively drummed into me that consistency, doing the same thing over and over and over again, is safe. And if you do something new, there's always a chance that it goes sideways. And there's always a chance that you may have to take ownership of a mistake. Now, for anybody who's been through teacher training, when you're having huge amounts of observations, this is scary. You are guaranteeing on graduating from your degree, you want to do things the way that you've been told to do. Experimenting with the new can get a little bit drummed out of you. But this is my first ever FE class. It was a creative technologies program at a college called Harlock on the North West Wales coast. And it was through a very particular piece of funding that targeted people who were not in education, employment or training. It created an opportunity for people who were kind of, I suppose, on the outside, who hadn't really been supported by traditional education to come back in. In this class, almost every age group was represented. So we had 17 through to 70, and almost every kind of decade in between, and almost every social class. So there was people who had been out of work for 5 or 6 years, who were really struggling, and people who were coming from very, very wealthy backgrounds, but just were out of employment or had retired. And there was different levels of technological engagement. I think we sometimes assume that these days everybody knows how to use a computer. I think sometimes we walk in and we assume everyone has a smartphone. The amount of things that you can't do unless you can download the app. I can't deal with my car. I can't book my car in for a service unless I have the app. Yet we know this isn't the case. And this group, I had a person who'd literally never turned on a computer in their entire life. They'd managed to avoid it intentionally because they were scared. They didn't want to deal with it. And they were on a creative technologies course, which is about as far out of their comfort zone as they could go. On the other end, I had a student who was regularly making movies on their computer. They were so digitally confident, they were teaching me things. I was in a pedagogic environment that I had no idea what to do. Every tool I had from my formal training was failing me, because what worked for one student didn't work for another, and I felt like I was letting some of them down. And I was in this position where, as I mentioned it here, I had to adapt to survive. And actually what I took away from this experience is this message that students aren't the same. Everybody comes from a different point of view in their life. Lecturers, academics, everybody comes from different levels of experience and different levels of confidence. And actually we need to innovate to match our environment. It's evolution. So, should we innovate everything all the time? And again, I go back to some of my favourite kind of grant applications and things like that, where they'll put innovation is key. Well, not always. You know, there's the reason why we haven't changed the wheel since it was invented. Okay, we've added tyres, we've added suspension, but fundamentally a wheel is a wheel because it works, and it works really well. The other thing is innovation isn't risk-free. Whenever you innovate, there is always a chance that things are going to go wrong. And this is part of what I'm going to talk about today. And again, this was my fear. I didn't want to innovate because I was concerned for my career. I was concerned things were going to go wrong. And actually, there are many examples where people have tried something new and it's been an absolute disaster. Also, many activities are interdependent. Things connect to each other. Changing one thing in one area can create significant disruption in another. And actually, communication, if these changes aren't being communicated well, that can cause more problems than almost anything else I've ever seen in a large organisation. Consistency can be stabilising. If everybody knows what we're doing, then we know how to train it. We know how to onboard new people. We know the process. I think sometimes places can get to a certain level of consistency where you stop recognising a process and start knowing processes by the name of the form that you're filling out. There is a balance in that. It's comfortable. And the other thing is innovation doesn't inherently make things better. Much like evolution doesn't inherently make things stronger, faster. Birds evolved from dinosaurs. I will still argue that the T-Rex can kick any budgie's bottom from here to the other side of the country. Innovation doesn't necessarily make things better, it just makes things change. It means you can adapt. This is one of my favourite paintings. Is anybody aware of this picture? I love this. I have this printed out. It's on my wall in my home office, very much because of what it represents. This is a lecture at the University of Bologna in Italy in the mid-14th century. And what I love about this is it highlights everything that potentially goes wrong with a lecture today in the 14th century. You have the academic at the front, very dryly reciting from a book. You have the keen beans on the front row, taking notes, reading. At the back, things have descended into conversation. And we have this poor fellow in the blue who's fallen asleep. Yet, fundamentally, the lecture format hasn't changed much since Socrates. It's this. And every year there is a new article in the Times Higher Ed or similar saying, the lecture is dead. And yet the lecture never seems to die. And the reason is, on the whole, when done well, a lecture is a fantastic form of education. There's few things that can be as inspiring, as engaging, as motivating. It's scalable, it's efficient, but quite often it ends up like this. So again, it's not always the tool that is wrong, but sometimes the things around that need to be innovated. And the point I really want to make with this is, innovation doesn't fix bad education. If your students are falling asleep in your class, there's other things going wrong than the fact that you haven't innovated. That is not a reason in itself to change. So how do we manage risk? I've mentioned that one of the challenges, one of the reasons we don't innovate, and higher education as a sector does tend to be relatively conservative. It tends to stick to things that it knows. But there's several ways that we can reduce or manage risk when we innovate. So being strategic with where we are innovating, making incremental changes. Let's not change everything in an entire year group with relatively short notice. By planning well in advance, phase KPIs, monitoring progress, keeping track of things. By not getting too attached. I think this is one of the big ones. And again, it's a real issue for sometimes with projects, they can very quickly become your baby. And sometimes it can be very hard to let go of that. Again, I've seen more dead horses flogged across HE than I care to note. And sometimes it's time to say that this hasn't worked and it's time to move on. We need to know our escape routes and our plan B. Whenever we change something, we should have a way of reverting or moving back, change back to something that we know works. But what I really want to focus this talk on is about engaging students meaningfully. I think one of the best ways that you can manage risk, one of the best ways you can avoid risk, is by involving your students and keeping them in the dialogue. So what is student engagement? Generally, when we talk about student engagement, we mean this thing on the left. A student who is turning up and actively participating. A motivated student, a keen student. It is not our student in the blue falling asleep. The engaged student is the ones at the front taking their notes. I would argue that student engagement is slightly different to that. And it's this thing on the right. Engaging students proactively in the learning environment. So getting them to embedded in decision making, using their voice throughout the education process, throughout the education environment. So in a Times Out article I wrote, I described it this way. If we make a dish, an engaged diner will be one focused on the meal and the dining experience. As chefs, we've prepared something they enjoy and they're motivated to eat it. By comparison, diner engagement will be inviting the diner to join the kitchen, ask them to help you plan the meal, maybe getting them tasting notes as you prepare the disc, perhaps even giving them a handle of the spatula. So, actually involving students in your decision making and your planning around innovation, it reduces risk by getting them invested from day one. Students feel that they are part of the journey, they're invested, they are part of the team, and they will help see this innovation through. They can also be more forgiving when things do go sideways, because you haven't surprised them with something. They've known that there is a risk. There's known that things can go on. It allows your innovation efforts to be targeted to areas where you're going to have the most impact. Students will happily tell you where they would like to see benefits of change. It adds stakeholders to ongoing innovation. Students can provide ongoing feedback. And again, this isn't unusual. Anywhere else in the sector, if we wanted to change things, we would engage with the stakeholders that we're working with. But the important one, I think, the thing that makes this really useful is students come with their own ideas and their own new perspectives. Right at the beginning, I said, the important thing about innovation is creating an environment where we have this free change of ideas. It's one of the tenets of open innovation. I think one of the challenges with engaging students is accepting that sometimes they may have the answer. And that can be quite a humble moment as an educator, accepting that maybe the answer to the problem sits outside of your remit. I accept that I'm a subject expert. However, I also accept that students are experts in their own learning. They know what works for them. By this point, they've been through at least 14 years worth of education. They'll have seen various different learning styles, well, teaching styles, don't get into learning styles. They will know what works for them. So, once we've engaged the students and we've talked to them and we're working with them to try and reduce that risk, we also need to find opportunities to innovate. And I think this is another challenge that we have generally in higher education. We quite often get trapped into two separate cycles. An inveterate process, so things that become habits. I mentioned them earlier, those things that we start knowing them by the form. We know the cycle, we know the lecture. We know that we can turn up, we can deliver a session. It is comfortable, it's habitual. It's something that's structurally robust that we know works. And again, sometimes it may not work particularly well, but it works well enough that we don't need to worry about it. At the other end of the spectrum, interventions. Quite often things will happen that we need to respond to, and we can get trapped in this loop of fighting fires. So something will happen, we respond to it. That causes something else to happen, so we respond to that. And we're constantly in this route of chasing our tails while we're constantly trying to put out fires everywhere. Innovation sits somewhere in the middle. Innovation is more planned, it's thought out, it's evaluated. Now, inveterate processes can become innovations. We can look at an inveterate process and say, we've done this way long enough, it is not performing as well as we would like, or it is not responding correctly to the current environment. We now need to change it. At the other end, an intervention can become an innovation. We've fought this fire, and actually what we've put in place works really well. So now we're going to try and make it more robust, we're going to try and make it more stable, and we're going to try and bring it into this point of stability. Interventions happen all the time, and I think sometimes we get a bit worried about fighting fires. But the reality is, and I'll put it up here, if your boat is sinking, you swim. You don't waste time planning your swim or writing a proper evaluation strategy for whether you'll judge whether the swim has been successful. Sometimes we just need to respond. Again, if there was a fire in this room, we would exit the door. Or we shouldn't fight fires. I'm pretty sure that would be in the against the health and safety code. But interventions aren't inherently wrong. And actually, sometimes we come up with our best ideas when we're forced into a situation where we have to respond to it. That's that classic saying, chaos is the mother of all invention. And it's true. And what we see, and the reason why we need to kind of be able to reflect and understand these different processes is understanding how they work. I won't go through this in great detail. This is a framework that I wrote. If anybody's interested in this, I'll happily send you more information out. But it basically works out the cycle of how intervention, innovation, and inveterate systems operate. So interventions always start with a response. We do something happens and we respond to it. We then will modify, assess whether that is working, and if it isn't working, we'll modify our response. Okay? And we do that relatively quickly. When we're doing interventions, it can almost be on a daily cycle of do, think, do, observe, think, change. Do, observe, think, change. It's quite involved, it's quite intensive. If anyone's ever found themselves, I mean, just out of interest, put your hand up if you ever think you've been caught fighting fires in a situation. It can be quite involved, it can be quite cognitively overloading, and you may not be doing any more work, potentially, but it's quite stressful, and you feel burnt out a lot quicker. Innovations, by comparison, they always start with a plan. We plan, we probably spend quite more time planning than we spend doing. We implement, we deploy, and then we compare. We actually say, right, how has this innovation changed things? And then inveterate processes, again, we're just continuing and we're updating. So if you think of this as a kind of a timeline, interventions will often take a day, 2 days. We're doing things on a relatively rapid cycle. Innovations, maybe 6 weeks, 2 months. Inveterate processes are often on a yearly cycle. And actually think about how many things that you may only evaluate once a year through module evaluations or through student marks. There's quite a lot of things that are inveterate. We generally want to move from left to right, from chaos to order. That's our natural tendency. We want to move things across. That's where we feel comfortable. There's nothing wrong with that. But why is it a good idea? Why do we tend to want to try and move our innovations, our interventions into innovations and innovations into inveterate processes? Largely workload. As processes become more ordered, they typically require less workload and less cognitive commitment. Every single one of these categories of activities, and the reason why I think it's really useful to recognize the type of activity you're doing at any one time, is recognizing the work it takes. Now, I put a survey out a few years ago now, asking people how much of their time they were dedicating to different activities in a week. And it came across a little bit like this. Interventions were taking huge amounts of time in planning, monitoring, and delivery. Innovations, a lot of time in planning, but the delivery was relatively fine. Whereas inveterate processes were moving relatively casually and were relatively easy to implement because we knew we had the processes in line. We had the materials repaired. There's some consistency. Again, if you're constantly changing things, how does your team keep up with what's going on? How do you keep up with the training? How do you onboard new staff if nobody knows what is the current way of doing things? If there's no policy or process, policy exists for a reason. And cognitive load. New processes require more attention. If you're fighting fire, you are not taking your eyes off the fire. If you're constantly feeling like you're chasing the tails, that is the level of investment that you end up putting into something. So, through this, what I've tried to say is innovation is useful, innovation is helpful, innovation helps us change, helps us adapt, helps us become unique. Engaging students can balance that out, can make that more not risk-free, but it can help you manage and reduce that risk. And then with the I3 framework, what I want you to think about is there's identifying areas where you can innovate, identifying areas where you can target, where you can see an opportunity for innovation. I want to give 2 examples of projects that I've done. Again, fully student engaged. This is the first one, video games live streaming. We used to, well, my old department, we used to do a lot of tutorials that were optional, that students turned up to, maybe with an industry partner coming along to, that were just part of the learning environment, but they weren't timetabled, they weren't credited. And as you might imagine, engagement in those activities wasn't very high. And that was despite them being absolutely fantastic. They were really well delivered. The people involved were fantastic. And actually, I think the sessions were planned and delivered exceptionally well. But students just weren't going along to them. So we went out to the students and we asked them, how would you like to see things done? What are you tuning into? What's your level of engagement? And they were watching Twitch streams. Now, Twitch streams are where people go online and they play video games with their peers. And they live broadcast that, usually framed around some sort of conversation or discussion. So we started doing these discussions as a Twitch stream. Me and my team, we would jump online, we'd play video games for anywhere up to 3 hours, and we'd have industry guests, or we'd be talking about portfolios, or we'd be talking about how can you get the most out of your university experience. Each one of these would be themed. Why streaming? Why the students wanted that? They were already on streams. They're already there watching. It was a relatively lower barrier to entry for them to see that we had gone online and move from their current stream to watching ours. It was informal. Play is inherently humanizing. There's nothing more humanizing than watching somebody in a position of power do something that we're really bad at. And we were all awful at playing video games. Video is based, it's replayable, it's accessible. There's fantastic accessibility features built in. And it's one of the world's most popular entertainment media formats. It is the fastest growing media format out there and accounts for, I think, about 4% of all internet bandwidth. And this is what it looks like if the video is going to play. I think when the video was converted from onto PowerPoint, it maybe hasn't come across. But effectively, you're playing a game, and for some reason at this point I was dressed up as a pirate. We were playing a pirate game, it all makes sense. And we were talking through how, in this one, how to develop a portfolio. So we spent 3 hours with a couple of guests from industry talking about how to develop a portfolio. And we had 80% engagement from across the whole cohort. So we'd gone from 4% engagement to 80. And 80 people who were watching the full 3 hours as well. Why did we bother playing the game? Well, largely because the students told us to. It provided an interesting backdrop to the discussion we were having, but also, as beautiful as I think I am, nobody wants to sit and watch my face for 3 hours talking through something. There's nothing particularly engaging in that. The game added some sort of visual substrate, and it held attention in the periods between discussion. So there was always breaks and questions, and in those breaks, people were watching us play a game, and it was holding their attention long enough to re-engage them in the discussion. Another project we did that came out of this process was something around learning community awareness. One thing that we noticed more and more and more is that a student's university isn't necessarily the university you work at. I worked for Staffordshire University. At the time I worked for the University of Lincoln. And I see the whole environment. All my colleagues, professional services, lecturers, the whole environment is part of that learning community. Students often don't. They see their immediate lecturers as their immediate learning community, which means they often miss out on opportunities, things like careers, well-being support, housing support, things like that. They often don't know even who these people are or that these departments exist. And we asked them why and said, well, you know, there's posters everywhere. We don't read the posters. But you've received emails. Yes, but I had 10 emails that day and it was low priority, so I didn't remember it. Okay, so how would you like to know? And eventually we came up with this idea of effectively getting all our colleagues from across the institution to do some laps in a virtual car. If anyone's ever watched Top Gear, Star in a Reasonably Priced Car, we recreated it. And we got our professional service colleagues and our colleagues from across the institution to do a lap. And we used that as a framing device for a conversation for somebody to introduce who they were and how they worked. Students were not watching for that. They were not watching for the conversation, the discussion. What they wanted to watch is some relatively important people in suits being really awful at driving a car. It was funny, much in the same way that people watch Star and Reasonably Priced Car. You watch it hoping that they're going to spin off the track or that they're going to do something ridiculous. And quite often, people did. And we did it on this motion simulator. So we've actually got this at Staffs at the moment. It's a 2-axis. So actually, as you're driving the car, you can do a full virtual recreation. And it was active research at the time. Students really don't realise how broad their learning community is. And there is people who have a massive impact on students' learning that they may never know who they are or what their name is. So we created 15 episodes of Star in VR. Originally, and all the students decided who they wanted to interview. So that first thing, actually went out and researched who worked at university. So the first engagement was them looking out and finding out who was there. They then did the interview themselves, managed all that. And originally I did all the filming and editing, but over time this was handed off to a student team as well. So towards the end, this was entirely student-led. And it completely replaced the way that we had for 10, 15 years, introduced members of the professional service team to students. Big thing with this, every team who filmed an episode with us saw an increase in student contact. The big one was our placements team, where in previous years, they'd been expecting about 6 to 7 students engaging with them in the first 2 weeks. After doing this, they jumped up to 90, and that continued to grow. We had a lot more students going to using the student support, student advice centre, especially around things like housing issues, where students hadn't actually realised they could get that advice and support from us. So a huge increase in engagement. And for us as a department, we saw a reduction in early stage withdrawals. So those students who don't transition well, who withdraw because they are homesick, things like that, we saw a massive reduction in those numbers. And again, this is another video. I'm assuming this probably won't work. But we had everyone from officers from the Students' Union. And for us as a computer science department, this was huge. Our department had, let's say, tense relationships with the Students' Union. For whatever reason, our students just didn't get on with the Students' Union. Could never really figure it out why. No one seemed to really know why. Something had happened 10 years ago and, that had just perpetuated. This episode starts off with one student saying, I really don't know what the Students' Union do. I don't know how they work. I don't know what they're there. And that was apparently annoying for them. So we invited Grace, who was at the time the VP for Communities. And she did an episode and she talked through what the Students' Union did, interviewed relatively robustly by our students. In the following year, the department, who had never had much engagement with the Students' Union at all, they did create things like creating new societies. They made use of the money in the advice centre that was available for the Students' Union. And importantly, we had students running for committee positions, which hadn't happened for quite a long time at this point. But it was also a great way to engage research in our education. Again, this was an active research project that also the students were interested in. They wanted to know more about our research. They wanted to know more about what we did. And we're using the Working Star in VR, made things like getting research participants easier. Actually, it made things like driving standards in dissertations a little easier because they understood what research was. They'd seen it. But it also helped us get our research out to collaborators as well, which was the start of driving some impact. So, closing thoughts before I do any questions. How do we create an environment that supports innovation? So this is something that often comes up, and I've kind of led through this throughout the talk. These are things that I think everybody can do within their role. If we're generally serious about innovation, this is how you can help colleagues to do it. Give people the structure to evaluate their practice. It is really, really important that you give them tools to evaluate in a way that is meaningful to them. And when I say meaningful, One bad lecture, one bad delivery on a module does not necessarily mean the module or the delivery structure is wrong. Again, if we were fishing in the same spot every year and every day we caught a fish, the one day that we didn't catch fish, we wouldn't move on. Sometimes we need that longitudinal, holistic data, and we need to be reasonable and considered. And those tools are actually relatively hard to develop. Create an open and honest dialogue with students. Be transparent in what you're doing. If you're trying something new, tell the students. If you want to try something new, ask the students. Get their opinions. That can really drive it, reduce risk, but also, again, never underestimate the ideas that the students have themselves. Encourage externality. Place people in situations where they can be exposed to alternative ideas. Events like this are essential for innovation. This is the veritable fertilizer that innovation grows from. Create a supportive culture that accepts innovation isn't risk-free. There are always times that things are going to go wrong. With your best intentions, things aren't always going to go right. And actually, if you're trying something new, sometimes you need to accept some risk comes with that. Encourage reflective practice and use evaluation to highlight opportunities to innovate. I talked about those three areas, interventions, innovations, and inveterate processes. Actually having the tools to reflect on what has become stagnant, what has become long-standing, and what needs to change. And also, where are we wasting time fighting fires? Are any of these ideas that you're implementing good? If so, what can we do to make them more stable? How can we make those more supportive? And decide where you want to innovate. Decide where and what. Again, being targeted with innovations can, again, help reduce risk. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Any questions?